Hi, Shawn. Andrew here. So I saw your email. I downloaded your data. Found some interesting things. First of all, yeah, obviously the prop you were using in the latest data was like 8 inches taller than the previous one. So just opening up the data here, I do see what you're saying. Obviously, one EGT to left bank, which is not very typical, is higher. So I'll give you my thoughts on that. If we just look at kind of channels report, your max speed was 112 miles an hour at around 75-ish, 7500-ish RPM. I can go there quickly just to see what it's looking like. So it's occurring right around here, 74, 7500 RPM. The EGTs are definitely not dangerous, but I don't really like the way that they're behaving, especially when you're backing off part throttle. The banks flip-flop. So I will bring up something to compare. So this is another run towards the end where your max speed you got up to was 104. So this was the second last time you started the engine. So if we just look at that, you were doing 104 at about 7,000 RPM, and your EGTs are both fairly cold. So one thing that's interesting is you flip-flop the EGT sensors. So if we go back to the previous run and we overlay kind of that comparison that I did where you did this full throttle run right here. So to look at that, uh, that's this one here. So you were going, obviously with a shorter prop, you were doing 107 miles an hour at 7,600 RPM. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. In terms of overlaying the EGTs, however, I guess first thing we'll do is graph an XY plot of speed versus engine RPM. So you can see here, if I put the axes on, you're going at 7,700 RPM, about 108 miles an hour with the old prop. With the new prop, this is what it looks like. So clearly offset. This is a good way to tell without even writing it down in the notes if the props are different. And I'm only looking at where you were full throttle. So effectively, with the new prop at the same speed, you're going uh, maybe here it's about 7,500 RPM at 105 miles an hour, and this one you're about 6,900 RPM. So about 600 RPM lower, this curve is shifted here. So that's a good way to tell that. The interesting thing is you did change the fuel pressure sensor, and it looks like it did change, but it was pretty stable. An interesting thing that you can do is if you go back to measures here, you can see where you let off the throttle exactly. So if I bring up the engine RPM, we'll go to the latest run with the higher pitch prop. If I just drag this over, you can see pretty much exactly where. I'll close this one just for a second, and then I will enable the next lap here. You can see pretty much where you let off, so I will. So the fuel pressure will drop a little bit because you're generating engine vacuum because the regulator is hooked up to the vacuum signal from the intake manifold. The fuel pressure will change here every single time you stab the throttle. So the numbers aren't really that relevant. It's changing about 2 psi, but when that happens is important. Here you can kind of see that you gradually let out of the throttle. So if we go back to comparing that run. We'll go back to XY plot here. We just have fuel pressure. I'll bring up your other one back up. And clearly the two fuel pressures are different, which we knew already. But right when you back off, they both go down. So you can see if I drag both of these over, they both decrease. So that's good to know. Open them back up just so they reset the time scales there again. So the most interesting part, in my opinion, is the EGTs. So if we bring both of them up here and go to XY plot, you can see left and right bank. I'll get rid of the per lap color. So for your shorter prop, the left bank here is the red and the pink is the right bank. So clearly the left bank's hotter by, like you said, maybe 120 degrees in the low range, maybe 100 in the high range. The thing that I'm concerned with is I'm not sure if you're manipulating the throttle here. I can't really tell with um, the fuel pressure. So it doesn't look like it's changing very much. So it doesn't look like you're changing the throttle. But at around 7,000, um, you have this weird feature in your fuel curve that's making this really cold dip here in the EGTs, and they're both doing it. The reason this is interesting is when we look at the data for the taller prop, it kind of does it in the same thing at a totally different speed. So around 6,800 to 7,000. Here you were only really going 7,000, but the EGTs dip, so they stop doing kind of this same trend at around 6,200. They start to go rich with the big prop, but here they kind of stabilize, and the reason for that is the reason the difference is here is just because the bigger prop gives it more time to actually heat up the sensor, and you might have been going at a faster speed to begin with. So you can see the left bank is the one that's always hotter. So for your latest prop, the dark blue is the left bank, and the light blue is the right bank. So the difference between the two, once again, is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is kind of odd. So there's two things that this could be, because you flip-flop sensors and it's behaving the same way once you flip-flop the sensors. The first thing it could be is the wire that you may have modified in order to shorten. So that's the yellow cable that's actually coming out with the bullet connector that plugs into or screws into the Evo 4. If you modified that in any way or crimped anything on or cut it or made it shorter, you're changing the internal resistance of that wire, and it's basically garbage after that. You can't modify those cables. So sometimes you might get away with it and it might give you reasonable data, but to be honest, I've never had luck with modifying those cables unless you have the right gauge and right copper wire to do it. And you need you can't just crimp the connections. Nothing can be crimped or soldered like that because there's a change in resistance across that joint, so it won't work. So that's option one. So if that's the case and you did change that cable somehow, we'll figure out how to fix that. You can flip-flop cables and confirm that the resistance in the cables is slightly different, and that's why when you flip-flop cables, you're even though you didn't touch the sensors, now the right bank is the one that's hotter. So hopefully that makes some sense. I don't really know which cable's the one that's wrong or incorrect, to be honest. Your EGTs in general kind of look cold. The right bank does look cold. It should be around what the left bank is, to be honest. The second thing that it could be is a water leak in the engine, meaning that in the exhaust cavity of the engine or even in the head gasket, but more likely in the exhaust cavity, at a certain speed range, you're just pumping water into that part of the engine. So if it's the left bank, because there's a gasket on the left and there's a gasket around the whole exhaust cavity, but if it's leaking somewhere on the left, it'll make that EGT read cold. Even though all of those cylinders are getting the right amount of fuel and everything, it'll make that EGT read cold. If it's on the right side, it'll make that one read cold just because it's leaking a small amount of water out the exhaust cavity before where it should. It should dump into the center section. So that's an option there too, that's leaking. Um, the other thing that's totally unrelated is the fact that both EGTs are kind of dipping at 7,000. Between 6,500 and 7,000 leads me to believe that the fuel map has some other, I wouldn't say issue, but it's just not optimized. It's not pulling towards that RPM. And the fact that the fuel pressures have changed a lot. It could be the sensor scaling, it could be the way that you've installed the sensor, but yeah, the fuel pressure most likely hasn't changed that much. So I'm not exactly sure what happened there. 36 to 39 psi is more reasonable for the regulator that you're running. And we can see it went from 28 to about 38. So the new reading looks more reasonable. So hopefully that makes some sense. Two things I'd like you to do is flip-flop the cable and see if now the right bank gets hotter. If you do have the exhaust cover plate off for whatever reason, or you can do a plug reading and see if all the plugs, or even better, the piston wash, if they all look good, and the fact that one bank is that much hotter, it's odd. So it would lead me to believe that potentially there's a water leak. And because the motor might be misbehaving in the 7,000 RPM region, it could be related to the fuel curve. It could be related to the water leak. If it's actually ingesting enough water to lower the EGT by 100 degrees on one bank, effectively you're just dousing the bottom cylinder on that bank. It's just getting a water mist ingested into it, and it's just not going to make full power. So we've seen this on a dyno before. It could be down anywhere from 50 to 60 horsepower, which is enough to get up to 105-ish miles an hour with a long enough run. But it really depends on what your water pressure is. If you have good water pressure, if you have too much water pressure, that could overcome the gasket too and cause issues. But anyways, check out those things. Get back to me, and I'd be happy to look at more data. It looks like your fuel now, your fuel level. Once you get moving, yeah, I agree. It's kind of so shaky that doesn't tell you anything useful. But in the beginning, it's pretty much always the stabilized value is around 95, and then as you go towards the end, you can see sometimes it stabilizes. But the benefit here, if we graph fuel level versus, let's say, longitudinal acceleration here, you might see more stable values if we remove, say, between 0.5 and negative 0.5 longitudinal accel, sorry, GPS longitudinal accel. Negative 0.5. So here you can kind of see that the data is a lot more stable as you get towards around zero-ish or 0.05, meaning that, yeah, most of the time your fuel level is between 90 and 65%. We can see towards the end of the run, which would have been run 8, lap 1. Yeah, your fuel level's still jumping around, but it's between 60 and 80. So you can filter this if you want in the data. Unfortunately, you can't do it on the screen. But if you go to measures and you right click here on the measure that you want to filter, you can apply a filter here and it will improve it slightly. Okay, so that'll take some of the noise out of it, and it especially helped, as you can see down here in the beginning. Once the sensor starts bouncing around, yeah, it's not the greatest, but when the boat is stopped, it should give you a reasonable reading. So hopefully that helps. I'll send you this video and let me know your thoughts.